right, let's get everybody in real quick and get Bible class started. It's good to see everybody this morning. Very good to see everybody this morning. We've got a good crowd. I know we'll have some people trickle in as well. In theory, okay, we should be experiencing a bell schedule today. We have tried to reset the bell schedule, but there is no promises that me and Wesley Benefield are intelligent enough to get that thing figured out. So if the bell starts ringing and doesn't stop ringing, somebody will have to go cut it off. That happened yesterday, but we'll try, and hopefully it'll work out just fine. We've got about 22 minutes of class instruction, and I promise this morning we are watching our video. Those of you who haven't been in this class so far, you'll know that we have been talking about a video we're going to watch that shows Bible geography, and we were going to watch it Wednesday night. We didn't get to it, so I promise you we will get to it today. I've got a reminder set on my phone. My phone will vibrate right here when it's time for me to be quiet and turn the video on. So I promise you I'll be quiet at that point. That means we need to get started quick. Let's open up to Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2. All right, we finished off cards number 1 and 2, that the angel came to Mary at Nazareth. And then we finished off card number 2 on Wednesday night, talking a little bit more about Jesus' birth and how Jesus was born in Bethlehem. So if we're just, there's some maps right there, Jerome, that y'all can have. And then the cards, this might be, that's Old Testament geography. I think Dana just took the box. So we finished off Mary communicating with the angel in Nazareth. And then, if you remember, we're following Jesus' family as they travel in his early years, as he's been conceived in the womb, and then as he's born, and the first few years of his life. We're going to look at those today and then watch our video. We're following their journey. So if you'll remember, Joseph and Mary from Nazareth take Jesus down to Bethlehem because there's been a census called by the Romans, and Joseph's family is from Bethlehem. So they have to go down to Bethlehem, and it is there where Mary gives birth to Jesus. And remember, we talked about that journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem. Would have been about like walking from Bowden to Columbus. It's a pretty lengthy journey, about 90 miles. And history tells us that Mary would have ridden on the back of a donkey. I don't know how Joseph convinced a 9-month pregnant woman to ride on a donkey, but I wouldn't be able to convince my wife, okay? But that was probably not just a hard journey because they traveled on foot. It was also a hard journey because she was pretty far along. And we know that because she gave birth while they were in Bethlehem. Now we're going to pick up there because in Bethlehem, while Joseph and Mary are there, it kind of seems like they stayed there for a pretty good length of time. We're introduced to this new group of people called the wise men. Now card number 3 is that the wise men traveled from the east to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, and then they went back to the east. I didn't have time or room to fit all that on the screen, so just kind of use the card as your guide for the answer there. The wise men traveled from the east to Jerusalem, to Bethlehem, and then back to the east. Now, the east is a very generic term. We don't really know where they come from. A lot of people think they may have been from Arabia or even that Babylonian area, possibly. We don't know, but these wise men were there. Okay, now in some translations, when we talk about the wise men are called the Magi, and you may have heard them referred to that way. Anytime around Christmas you see nativity scenes, anytime you see someone talk about the birth of Jesus, the wise men are brought up. And how many wise men are in the nativity scene? 3 of them, right? Of course, one of the big things about the Bible, we don't know how many there were. There could have been 2. We know there are at least 2 because it's a plural. But we don't know how many how many there were, and it really doesn't matter, does it, how many there were? But traditionally, the nativity scene includes 3, but it's kind of like the apple in the Garden of Eden. We don't really know what the fruit was, or that Jonah was swallowed by a whale. The Bible says a fish. Just one of those facts that we have kind of put forward in our mind, but we're not quite sure the details about it. Okay, wise men are not just mentioned here in the Bible, though. They're mentioned all throughout the Bible. For instance, do you remember in Esther chapter 1 when the king wanted his wife, Queen Vashti, to come and dance before his group of people in his palace, and she said no? The king reached out to the Magi, the wise men, and he said, "What should I do with this queen?" And they gave him an answer. Daniel chapter 2 and verse 12, if you remember, King Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He called in the wise men and he said, "I want you to tell me not only what my dream was, but I want you to tell me how to interpret it," which would have been a doubly hard task. If you just hear a dream, you can make anything up. And that was kind of Nebuchadnezzar's thought was, well, if they're really wise, they'll not only tell me what the dream meant, but they'll just tell me the dream in general. And he didn't tell them what it was. And they couldn't do that. And the king, King Nebuchadnezzar, reached out to kill all the wise men. Same thing, same word, the word magi in the Bible. Sometimes you have magi mentioned in the Bible that are not good. They're opposers of the truth. They're very given over to magic arts. Simon the sorcerer in Acts chapter 8 would have fit this same description of magician. Okay, a couple of points just to point out about them before we get to the actual story of Matthew chapter 2. The magi in this particular text seem to be those that are not interested necessarily in just gaining popularity or money. They seem to be really interested in the truth. And if you have a New American Standard Bible, you're going to have a footnote in there that's going to mention that the magi, they specialized in astrology, medicine, and natural sciences. That's kind of where they got their fame from. You know, they would look to the stars and to the universe for answers. They would, in many ways, use like holistic medicine, things like that to try and heal people. Okay, that was kind of their forte. Okay, Matthew chapter 2, let's begin, and I guess we'll read all 13 verses here of Matthew chapter 2, Matthew 2, 1 through 13, and read about the wise men. Okay, Matthew chapter 2, and this is going to introduce us into our next card. So this is a very fundamental passage for the next card we're going to look at. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, hold on to the name Herod the king, we're going to get back to him. In the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. There's your geography point of this card. They came from the east to Jerusalem, saying, where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him. Now, there was some question about the Star of Bethlehem. You remember just recently there was a lot of discussion about the Star of Bethlehem, that you would see it in the sky again. Actually, that question was submitted to our Q&A box, and we're going to talk about the Star of Bethlehem tonight during the Q&A. So hold on to that Matthew chapter 2 and verse 2 verse. We'll look at that tonight. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. Assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. They told him, in Bethlehem of Judea. For so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. When Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained them what time the star had appeared, he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child. When you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star which had been seen when it rose, went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. Verse 9 is a good indication that God had his hand very deeply in the rising of this star. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, rise, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. Remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. Okay, this text tells us a couple of things. First of all, the Bible tells us that Jesus was unlike any other king, really, in the time, especially Herod. Herod would have been appointed as a ruler. Jesus was born as a king. He didn't have to earn that right. He didn't have to rise to power. Jesus was born King of the Jews, and that's a bunch of Old Testament prophecies that are some cited here, and then others from like Isaiah 53, the suffering servant and such. Okay? Herod, being a man who was in power, kind of was filled with dread because of this child being born, right? Someone who is born King of the Jews could definitely dethrone him and take over his rule. And so he inquires of these wise men what to do. Now, an interesting detail about this, first of all, is we don't really know why the Magi followed the star. No idea. That's not revealed in the text here. Maybe it's the case that, some kind of revelation comes to them. They came, in verse 1, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem. Now, there's been a lot of discussion in some of the commentaries I've read about, this being revealed to them in some way, okay? But that's Matthew chapter 2. All right, we also kind of see that the Magi would have been of the Gentile origin. Okay, they wouldn't have been Jews, which is a whole other interesting fact that they come and worship the king of the Jews. Notice it doesn't say that they worship their king, they worship the king of the Jews. Probably a foreshadowing to the hint that Gentiles would be included under the reign of Jesus. All right, any discussion, comments, or questions on the Magi and the wise men? Okay, remember they brought the gifts to Jesus. We learn that often in the nativity story, and we're going to talk about that here in just a moment. Okay, card number 4. Card number 4. What country did Jesus escape to? Egypt. This is kind of misleading because Jesus himself didn't escape. He was probably carried. He was an infant. But nonetheless, Jesus escaped to Egypt through the guiding of an angel. Matthew chapter 2 and verse 13 is where that angel comes to Joseph. Again, throughout the story of Jesus, you see angels intervening in the plan so that God's will is performed. Okay? And also the fulfilling of prophecy of Jesus coming up out of Egypt is important in card number 4. Now, why did Jesus have to flee to Egypt? You remember from the text? Why did the angel say they need to go to Egypt? All right. King Herod. Obviously, this man is upset that Jesus, called someone who's born king of the Jews, could take over his throne. And so he decides, this is foreshadowed or forewarned by the angel, that he's going to go and he's going to kill all the children within the age that Jesus would have been in the city of Bethlehem. That's starting in verse 14. And he rose and took the child, this is Joseph, and his mother by night, and they departed to Egypt. They remained there until the death of Herod. This was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, out of Egypt I called my son. All right, verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all the region that were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Okay, we again in this passage learn 2 things. First of all, we learn about the character of Joseph. It also gives us an indication of any individual that desires to be a man that leads his family. Joseph is a man who has tremendous character to follow after. Okay, first of all, Joseph understood the ridicule. We talked about this Wednesday, that would come from the actions of him and Mary. They would be viewed in a very degrading way. Of course, Mary said that she was pregnant by the Holy Spirit, which would have, of course, we've discussed at length, been something that people thought was likely crazy. Joseph was warned by an angel to take her because what she said was true, and so he took her as his wife. Probably both of them would have been ridiculed. Okay, so Joseph had character in that respect. He also had character in that he took her to Bethlehem and didn't really hesitate to find a place for her to give birth. Like, he seems like he took care of her and made sure she had somewhere to give birth to a child. On top of that, as soon as the angel warned him, he took his family and went down to Egypt. Now, that's something to say they went to Egypt. It's another thing to understand that probably would have been like a 200-mile journey to not only take your wife, who has just given birth, likely within the recent year, but also a child that would have been under a year old traveling to Egypt. It would have been a significant journey that he took. I think we learn a lot from the character of Joseph throughout this story. Now, we don't know how long Joseph and Mary lived in Egypt. No clue how long that took place. It was probably more than just a few weeks. But one interesting question that I found in a commentary that I really didn't think about was the commentator kind of posed, well, what did Joseph and Mary do to provide for each other? How did Joseph provide for his family while he was in Egypt? It's likely he would have gotten work, but this commentator actually suggests that God provided for them through the gifts from the Magi. They would have had expensive gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And it's very likely they could have sold those gifts and lived off of that while they traveled to Egypt. So, we already know that Mary and Joseph were poor. When they went to dedicate and redeem Jesus at the temple, they gave the poor person's offering, the offering of poverty. Instead of buying a lamb, they had to buy 2 turtle doves. So we know they didn't have a lot of money. But when they went to Egypt, they would have had to live. And so it seems that maybe, according to this guy, God provided for them. Probably all of us in here can think of a time in which we didn't think things were going to work out. We didn't think ends were going to meet. We were frustrated because we felt like we were kind of out of control of whatever was before us, and God provided for us in some way. The Bible even seems to indicate that God is generous and provides to those who often practice generosity. That's Galatians chapter 6. You're going to reap what you sow. And probably all of us could give some kind of example of how God, in very interesting and providential ways, provides for us. Not to mention that God provides for us food and shelter, and he's the sustainer of life. All of that. Okay? Last card here, and then we're going to watch the video. Art card number 5. You have the hometown of Jesus. What was the hometown of Jesus? Where did he grow up? Nazareth. They leave Egypt, head right back up to Nazareth, and that's where Jesus spends the majority of his life. We're not given any details about Jesus growing up except for one. And what's the one detail we have about Jesus growing up? What happened? Right? He was 12 years old. They're in Jerusalem. They're there for the Passover. And the family leaves, realize that Jesus isn't with them, which, understandable. They probably were in some kind of caravan. Might have thought he was over there with, Aunt so-and-so or Uncle so-and-so, whatever. Realize he's not with them. They go back. The text actually says that they looked for him for 3 days. I mean, they didn't have like phones and stuff, so they wouldn't have just been able to put out an Amber Alert or anything like that, okay, like we do today. 3 days they search for Jesus. And when they find him, what's Jesus doing? Right? He's at the temple, and he's speaking with the religious leaders of the time. Now, this is shocking in a couple of different ways. First of all, Jesus was 12 years old, and he was concerned about spiritual things. Okay, most boys at 12 years old, spiritual things might be in their mind in some way. There are some children that are just more mature than others. But 12 years old, I don't have a 12-year-old, so I don't really have a whole lot of experience in this. But it seems like a lot of 12-year-olds are just kind of interested in shooting each other with Nerf guns and video games, stuff like that. Jesus was a young boy who was interested in spiritual things. Not just that, the Bible says that they were amazed at Jesus' answers, okay? He was giving answers to spiritual questions. They were having spiritual conversation, and they were amazed at how much he knew. I can remember sitting at Faulkner when I was there and sitting amongst some of the professors, and we were just kind of, we would bat around theology and doctrinal questions, and it was really interesting to see them develop out of their experience in their mind these ideas from the Bible, things I'd not had the time to learn in my short years. To see a young man at the age of 12 would have been really interesting. We don't have time to go through the rest of this, but that is cards 1 through 5. Now, I promised you a video. I promised you we're going to watch it. What this is, and I'm going to pull up our video here. This is simply a video that was made by some folks that are members of the church in Texas. And they went to the Holy Lands and basically just explored the Holy Lands and videoed it and put it on YouTube. You can find these. It's a series called Following the Messiah, made by Appian Media. Don't necessarily know everything about these guys, but I've watched this video like 5 or 6 times. It's super, super good. It'll give you some ideas of where things are geographically, and hopefully it'll be interesting to you. They're going to talk about Herod. They're going to talk about the birth of Jesus. They're going to talk about the announcement to Mary and Elizabeth. They're going to go walk amongst what we see today as the Temple Mount and the stairs, the steps Jesus' family would have walked up. So I hope you find it interesting.
Such a humble beginning. His arrival wasn't announced to kings. It wasn't made before large crowds. Jesus' birth was revealed to men protecting sheep. And yet, could this have been any more fitting for a man who would become the greatest shepherd in the world? We're here in Israel. It's episode 1. We're trying to focus on the birth and the infancy of Jesus. So what are some of the things that we're going to try to go see and visit today?
Well, the first thing we're going to go see is down in Bethlehem. This is where the traditional location of where Jesus was born. Of course, we know he was born in the city, but there's a number of different ideas about exactly where. But we're going to go to one particular place called the Church of the Nativity.
Okay, so we know from the Gospels that during a Roman census, Joseph and Mary come down And when they get down to Bethlehem, there's no room for them in what the English version says is an inn. We have some images in our imagination that we conjure up when we picture an inn.
The word in the book of Luke is the word kataluma, which literally means a guest room. So when they arrived in Bethlehem, there was no room in the guest room.
Okay.
Which makes sense because there were a number of families there who have come for the census.
That's going to be an interesting sight. You know, we're crossing a border there to go into Bethlehem.
Even though Jerusalem and Bethlehem are only 6 miles apart, there is a security barrier there between Israel and the West Bank.
Now, Luke, the historian of the Gospels, records that in those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria, and all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because he was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. Now, the text talks about Mary and Joseph going up, even though they're heading south. Could you explain that?
The idea here in the scriptures is that you're rising in elevation. The city of Nazareth sits in the Galilean hills, and from the Jezreel Valley, which is fairly close to sea level, you will rise nearly 3,000 feet coming to Jerusalem.
Now, we really want to go see the first century steps at the southern wall of the Temple Mount. There's some significance there to the birth and the infancy of Jesus.
There is. After Jesus was born, his family, being a good Jewish family, went to Jerusalem to have him dedicated at the temple, and they would have gone up those first century steps that we will visit.
All right, so there's some significant events that take place in the life of Jesus, just even at 40 days old.
Bethlehem is only 6 miles to our south. It sits in the West Bank, and so we'll need to travel down there to see all this.
I had no idea Bethlehem was that close to Jerusalem. I'm really excited to go see the Church of the Nativity. To the Church of the Nativity, Barry explained the different sized doors and the humility gate, or the humility door. You have to bow to get underneath it.
What we're looking at here is a statue of Jerome, who translated the Latin version of the Vulgate.
These arches are incredible.
They are. They're really pretty.
I'm really glad you brought me here.
Oh, this is one of the places I really love to come. But as pretty as this church is, there's something underneath the ground that I think you'll be interested in. Well, one of the things I appreciate about traveling around Israel is because it helps me to make the Bible stories even more real.
Barry, in Matthew chapter 2, Matthew records that after the birth of Jesus, Herod is trying to get him. He's threatened by this king that's going to take his kingdom. And so in a dream, Joseph is told to take Mary, take Jesus, and flee to Egypt. They do that. Herod is frustrated that he missed his opportunity. And so in Matthew 2:16, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, he became furious and sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and in all that region who were 2 years old or under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Now, that verse is connected to what we're standing next to.
It is. What they found in here are a number of burial chambers and ossuaries in which small children, very young children, were buried. There's some first century tombs down there that they think this is where a number of the babies that during the first century were buried. And this possibly relates to the story in Matthew's 2nd chapter that we read about.
Now, when my mind goes to that event and I read through the Gospels, I think of a larger city. I think of hundreds of children, thousands of children that would fit that criteria. But that's really not what's going on here, is it?
No, it's not. In fact, Bethlehem of modern day is around 60 to 70,000 people. Bethlehem in the first century would have just been several hundred. And so when we think about all the children who were killed, it wasn't in the hundreds or thousands. It was really probably in the number of dozens. Of course, any death is one too many.
To think about what Herod did because he thought Jesus was a competitor to his throne is just, it's horrifying. It's such a haunting reminder of such a terrible time. And all of that was an attempt to get at Jesus as an infant. It was very sobering. It's very sobering to think about. Down in this cave, they found the remains of children that Herod massacred trying to kill Jesus as an infant. And to think that that was the way things worked, I mean, Herod the Great ended up killing some of his own children, one of his own wives, so it wasn't unprecedented for him. But that's not something that civilized people do. That's not something that's a part of our culture. And so it was sobering. It really established the reality of the event. This isn't something that was imagined. It wasn't something that was made up. You know, with fairy tales and everything else, you want to dress things up and get rid of the ugly parts. And the Gospels don't do that. The Gospels say, this is what happened, even if it's not pleasant, even if you wish it hadn't. And that was one of those moments. Up at the front, there are 3 different religious groups, 3 different churches that maintain the main portion of the church. There was one group that came in and they were praying and doing their morning mass, and then another group came in and they were supposed to clean up, and then another group came in and went down and prayed inside of the cave. So to watch multiple groups maintain the same space was really, I mean, it was different. That's not anything I've ever seen. Barry was able to take us to the cave where the traditional location of Jesus' birth was, and the traditional location of where the stone manger was found that he was laid in. When we use the phrase a traditional location, we mean that this location has a rich heritage going back millennia in some instances to identify a general location.
A lot of the times that means we have a history of people passing down that information from generation to generation.
We may not know the exact rock or piece of dirt, but it's fairly confident to say it's in this general area that this event took place. And we should probably add that God never meant for us to worship a piece of ground. He never meant for us to worship a specific site. What was important for him was what happened at those places.
All right, Jeremy, this is what I wanted to show you. We're down in a cave underneath the Church of the Nativity here in Bethlehem. This is the traditional location of where Jesus Christ was born. The 14 points around the star represent the generations from Abraham to David, David to the exile, in the exile to Jesus.
And those 14 generations, those are captured for us in Matthew chapter 1.
That's right.
And all day long, people are going to be coming down here. They're going to be touching it. They're going to be kissing it. They're going to be leaving prayers down in this little alcove. Now, this marks that spot, but there's something else down here we want to see.
Yes, on the other side of the cave here, there is a little alcove in which they believe the manger sat.
Let's go look at that.
Okay.
Barry, we're only about 12 feet away from that 14-pointed star. What is it that we're looking at?
Well, we read in the Bible that after Jesus was born, that they laid him in a manger. As you can see here, we're underneath this little cave, this little alcove in the cave here. This is the traditional location of where that manger laid.
This was a fantastic honor to be able to come down here.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
I think one of the misconceptions that most Westerners have ties back to the idea of Jesus was born in a barn. There was no room in the hotel, so they went to the stables, and he was placed in a wooden trough, and just that whole picture. And understanding the cultural difference, no, there was no room in the family guest house, so they went to this cave where the animals were kept for privacy and seclusion and placed in a stone manger after he was born. I think corrects a lot of cultural misunderstandings. It's hard to imagine what that must have looked like because so much structure has been built on top of it. It's not natural rock. They've been burning incense down there for millennia. They have pictures
of Mary and Jesus as an infant all over the walls. You have all kinds of decorations, and it's hard to imagine. But one of the things that did help was it communicated the idea of going into a cave. You take these steps down and around a curve, and so you have the sense of you're going underground. You think about the Son of God coming down to earth and being born in the back of a cave with animals in the seclusion and privacy of the hills of Bethlehem, without any trumpeting, without any fanfare, without any attendance other than his parents. And to think about how humble his beginning was. And that was intentional. He was willing to choose that. And to get a better visual of that drives that point home even more strongly. Up to the sheep, they were slowly munching grass coming towards us, and we could hear this underlying crunching and munching, and there were a couple of them that were wearing the bells, so you could hear a couple ringing, and we were trying to figure out which one has the bell around its neck. There was one that looked to be lame, and so he was slowly following all the rest of them. And then to see this young boy, who barely looks like he's in his teens, was leading this flock of dozens of sheep around. And it was just really sweet to watch. It was very tender. One of the things that Luke records for us in chapter 2 is that in the region of Bethlehem, the same region that Jesus was born, that night there were some shepherds out in the field with their sheep. And as they were tending their flocks, an angel came and announced the birth of Jesus. And they celebrated and wanted to go meet him. It would have looked a lot like this. It would have been dark. There would have been the bright light. And as they rejoiced, they would have been excited to know that the Messiah had been born. Being out there on that hillside, it was so much easier to imagine the night of Jesus' birth and to imagine a dark hillside while these shepherds are putting their sheep down for the night. They're resting, it's quiet and calm, and then all of a sudden, there's this angelic announcement about the birth of the Messiah, and they start worshiping and praising, and I've just got that image stuck in my head now.
And our guide actually made a great point when we were out there in the fact that because shepherds are always awake while they're working and because they see other flocks and other shepherds, that the best way during the first century to carry a message out is through the shepherds. And so maybe that was why God chose to send the angels to the shepherds first, because they would be able to spread the word, spread the good news of the birth of Jesus.
One of the things coming to Israel does is it helps put into perspective distances. I always visualize Bethlehem is just an hour's drive or 2 hours drive from Jerusalem. You know, Bethany is so far over here. The Mount of Olives was so far over here. That's not the case. So the distance just from Bethlehem to Jerusalem
Is 6 miles. 6 miles.
That's a 1 hour walk. You know, that's less than a 1 hour walk if you're jogging or really trying to get it done. And so to realize it really wasn't that far from where Joseph's family was to come to the Temple Mount. They had already traveled all the way down from Galilee to Bethlehem. To get from Bethlehem to the Temple Mount was nothing. And to be here in person and to have made that trip puts that in perspective.
And I think also you get an appreciation for not only distance, but altitude. One of my favorite verses in the Bible is from Luke chapter 19, in which it says, and Jesus, after finishing his conversation with people in Jericho, it says he went up to Jerusalem. Well, what does that mean? It's a simple phrase, but what we learn is just within that 15 miles, you go up nearly 3,500 feet in elevation. Your ears are popping and all kinds of things as you go up the hill. It gives you a great appreciation for exactly what Jesus went through as he went up the mountain.
The historian Luke records for us over in chapter 2, when the time came for the purification according to the law of Moses, they brought Jesus up to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male who first opens the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. Now, we are standing right next to the Temple Mount on a Herodian, a first century road. This is the area that they would have come to present Jesus.
They would have. They would have come to Jerusalem to present Jesus in the temple.
So they've come down from Galilee because of the census. They stop in Bethlehem. Mary gives birth there. And then they bring Jesus to the Temple Mount. And we're standing in the shade of the Temple Mount right now. So this is a totally different feel than what they were used to back home up in Galilee. A slower pace, it would have been more calm, more rustic, fewer people. And then they come to the hustle and bustle of Jerusalem.
And this would really be the big city. I
Yeah.
mean, they have really come to the big city. Up in Galilee, you have farms, and you have, of course, the lake, and all the serenity that's up there. But when they came here, this would have been an eye-opening experience for any of the Jewish people coming from the north.
And we know that they made annual trips down to Jerusalem, but this would have been a special trip.
It would have been for the family, yes.
You know, the birth of their firstborn. They're coming to the temple to dedicate their son. They would have been purchasing some small turtle doves or something from the shops along the way here. How do we know that this is a first century road? What identifies it as that?
Well, this road was uncovered by archaeologists about just a couple of decades ago. This road is very typical of roads of that time. It has the same look and feel that other Herodian roads do. As you'll notice, there are some holes in the road. That is caused for two reasons. One is it's 2,000 years old.
Okay.
And so it is just sunk in a little bit. And the other has to do with all these big boulders that are here behind us. We know that in 70 AD, the Romans destroyed the city of Jerusalem. And when they did, they burned the temple and burned a lot of the things up there. In doing so, they pushed a number of the rocks off of the Temple Mount, and they landed on this road, and that caused a lot of damage to this road
They're
as well.
huge. I mean, those aren't even potholes. I mean, you could fit a car
Yes.
inside of some of those.
Large holes.
Now, when they uncovered the road several decades ago to help us understand the size and the weight of those stones, they left the street the way it was.
They did. And it helps us to appreciate just how destructive the Romans were to this city at that time.
There are layers of history to walking on this first century street. We have rubble from the destruction of the Temple Mount in 70 AD by the Romans. To the side, you see the shops. It helps you visualize what was going on around the Temple Mount. And of course, we know that Jesus was frustrated by that when he went there as an adult. The pavement, the stone pavers are huge. They're huge. I mean, everything that Herod did was on such a massive scale. And to see the finesse and the beauty and the scale and just everything was overwhelming.
Being able to walk on that Herodian street, knowing it's the exact same street that many people in the first century would have walked on, that's just awe-inspiring because you realize that you're walking through history.
And when we're there, Barry's trying to reconstruct things for us. So while we're looking at the wall and see just a few stones jutting out of it, he's trying to explain there was this arch that came out, and then there were some steps that led down to it. And so he's trying to fill in the gaps, and you're trying to picture in your mind's eye what this looked like complete. And he does a great job at that. To get the idea of the magnitude of what we're looking at, there is a rock in that wall under the ground. You can go see that. It's over 500 tons heavy, 45 feet long, and you can see other stones a little bit smaller than that, but still hundreds of tons, and they make up the blocks of this western wall of the temple. And so as you're walking along this first century Herodian street, Mary and Joseph would have been seeing that. You know, it was a source of pride for the Jews to have such a glorious Temple Mount. When we look at the Temple Mount, when we look at the shops and the stones that make up those structures, there's something unique that makes them Herodian as well too. What is that?
King Herod not only built big things, he wanted to make sure that it looked good. And if you look at a lot of the stones here on the Temple Mount and the Western Wall and even on these shops behind us, not only are they perfectly cut and perfectly set in place, but they all have little etching around them.
I mean, some of the things that people have pointed out is that you can't even slip a piece of paper. Even now, 2,000 years later, you can't fit a piece of paper into some of those cracks.
That's correct. Each one of these stones was specifically cut for the position it's located.
So that's amazing from a design, engineering, architectural standpoint, that they were able to do something so refined 2,000 years ago.
That's right. Many of these stones were...
All right, there's about 3 minutes left in this. So I chose not to send this out on Wednesday night so that you can watch it this morning. I'll send this link out this afternoon if you want to watch the rest of it. Let me kind of explain for just a moment. Bud, could you hit the lights back there, sir? Let me explain for just a moment why I'm presenting these videos to you and why we're studying this. 2 Peter chapter 1 talks about the Christian graces, and it says that all of us, as we grow as Christians, should make every effort to add to our faith virtue, to our virtue knowledge. One of the things about growing as a Christian is growing the amount of knowledge I have about the Bible. I really feel like a class like this on geography, understanding the layout of the Holy Land, how Jerusalem was set up, the implications of some of the things written in the New Testament, especially about Jesus' life, help us to grow our knowledge. 2 Peter chapter 1 and beginning of verse 5. It helps us to be stronger Christians. So that's why we're presenting this geography details. That's why we're wanting to focus on a lot of this stuff so that we can all grow together as Christians and grow in knowledge. A lot of the stuff that you probably saw in that video were things that probably made sense to you, things that reminded you of this stuff we've talked about. You remember they went to a lot of these traditional locations. One of the things they'll do in this series of videos we'll look at is they'll go to the traditional location of where Jesus was buried, the tomb that Joseph of Arimathea put him in. Again, remember, traditional locations, as they pointed out, are just kind of passed down through history. But you kind of saw a little bit of what we talked about Wednesday. You know, we talked about how the Israelite houses were set up, and, you know, a lot of homes would be built into natural rocks and hillsides. And, you know, we talked about how the place where Jesus would have been born wouldn't have been like a barn standing out somewhere. It'd been like, you know, somewhere under a house, a cave, basement type is the example we used Wednesday night, like a basement below a house. All of those are details that help the story of the Bible come alive to us. And so I hope that you enjoy us studying through all these details. I hope you enjoy us looking at a lot of this that I hope puts in perspective some of the things about Jesus' life. We've got about 3 minutes left. That was a 5-minute warning bell. I forgot to announce this at the beginning, but our bell system is set up to where in class we'll have a 5-minute warning, and then we'll have the bell after that dismisses class. So we got about 3 minutes. I want to go through one more thing in the young life of Jesus before we dive out of this particular class and move on to worship. We talked about in card number 5 that Jesus was raised in Nazareth, and that Jesus spent a lot of his childhood in this small town of Nazareth. We know very little about it, but we do know Luke chapter 2, we talked about him being 12 years old and going to Jerusalem. There's a lot that I think are unanswered questions you and I would want to know about the young life of Jesus. But I think Luke chapter 2, beginning in verse 51 and then verse 52, gives us some indication of the life that Jesus lived. God intended for Jesus to live a life that was similar to ours and to experience things just like you and I did. I have no doubt that in Jesus' young life, he would have spoke his first words. I don't know what his first words would have been, but Jesus would have spoken his first words. He would have probably played with the kids in Nazareth. He probably would have done things like all of us do because he was a child that grew up. One of the interesting questions that comes out of this story in Luke chapter 2 of Jesus going to Jerusalem, one thing I've wondered is, when did Jesus realize what he was supposed to do? I wonder if you've ever thought about that. At what point did it click in his mind that he was supposed to do what he was supposed to do? I've often wondered, was it like a flashlight? Like you just turn the flashlight on and suddenly he knows? Or was it kind of like the dawning of the morning, that it just slowly unfolded in his mind and he understood? Did God come to him personally? Because when Jesus was born, he was a child. He was a baby. He wasn't a grown man stuck in a baby's body. We know that. He would have been a baby just like us and would have grown like us. Luke chapter 2 and verse 52 says that Jesus increased in wisdom and in stature and in favor with God and man. But how did Jesus come to realize that he was not only the Son of God, but that there was a point to him living? There's a lot of things we could say about it, but I think Luke chapter 2 and verse 51 and verse 52 kind of surmise what we can expect. Luke chapter 2 and verse 51 says that Jesus, even though he knew who he was, he still submitted to his parents. I think it's a really powerful statement in verse 51. It said he went home with them from Jerusalem and he submitted to them as his parents. I mean, if anybody really had an excuse like, well, I'm the Son of God, so, you know, I will not do my chores. But if anybody could have said that, I think that Jesus would have only had the right to, but based on the nature of him being God in the flesh, he wouldn't have done that. Because God's intention is for children to obey their parents. And Jesus did that, Luke 2:51. He submitted to his parents. The other side is that Jesus didn't start what he was meant to do in his early 20s or even his teens. And we talked about how God used Mary at a young age. God used Moses at an old age. Jesus was probably estimated around the age of 30 when he began his ministry. He prepared himself. Any great deed you and I do requires self-preparation. Okay? Any comments or questions or concerns about this section of our cards? Okay, that's through card number 5. We'll pick up and begin to talk about Jesus' public ministry. So in our study, we'll jump from Jesus being 12 to suddenly Jesus around the age of 30. We'll start that Wednesday night. Thank you for your attention. I hope the video was interesting to you, and if it is, we'll try to watch more of those. Hey, Adam, could you stop that live stream back there?